Revolution was in the air on Berner Street on the evening of Saturday the 29th of September 1888, as it was every Saturday night at the International Working Men's Club, a socialist meeting house at 40 Berner Street established in 1885 by Polish Jewish immigrants. Eastern European Jews were a relatively recent arrival to the East End, coming in numbers after the wave of pogroms that washed over the Pale of Settlement in the Western Russian Empire in the wake of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. While many of these immigrants came from the shtetls, small predominantly Jewish villages, many belonged to the growing urban proletariat, the emerging industrial labouring class. In 1897, the secular and political factions of this population would form the Jewish Labour Bund, an important movement within the wider revolutionary movement in Russia at this time that would ultimately topple the regime in the October Revolution of 1917. Jewish socialist clubs like the Berner Street Club in 1888 were proto-Bundist organisations, watched closely by special branch and mistrusted and rejected by religious Jews, both immigrant Eastern European Jews and the established English Old Jewry. These clubs were not only political institutions, they were cultural centres for secular Yiddishkeit in this new diaspora. Political meetings were held inside, and the club on Berner Street had a portrait of Karl Marx hanging in pride of place. Besides politics, they were places where Russian, Polish, Lithuanian and Ukrainian Yiddish-speaking Jews would get together for social events and celebrations. Truth be told, the Berner Street Club sounds like it was a lot of fun on a Saturday night. It was likely as much crack as any of the Irish bars nearby. Louis Diemschütz, a hawker of costume jewellery, was then the steward of the club and lived on the premises with his wife. He was an activist. We know he got himself nicked and sent down for 3 months after an affray with the police on Berner Street when East London anti-Jewish rioters attacked the International Working Men's Club in 1889, and that in 1891 he delivered a lecture on the Paris Commune to a packed socialist club in Manchester. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, now the early hours of Sunday the 30th of September, this man Diemschütz was arriving home back to 40 Berner Street after a long day selling at Crystal Palace. His idea coming into Berner Street was to drop his cart and goods off at Dutfield Yard, the narrow close running between numbers 40 and 42, where the side entrance to the International Working Men's Club was, before taking his pony on to the stables at George Yard on Cable Street. At this time, as all the evidence given confirms, the streets were buzzing with life. This was the tail end of a Saturday night, the night before the only day in the week most working people had off. People were out and about. They were visiting friends and relatives. They were in the public houses, they were in social clubs like the Berner Street Club, having a drink and singing songs. In no sense was Diemschütz arriving into a deserted and dark street. The large wooden gates to the yard were open, they were ajar. They were usually open. Inside the yard there was light from the open door of the clubhouse and light spilling from a number of the house windows inside the yard. But tight behind the gates, there was complete darkness for a few feet, as there was no gas jet or lamp inside the yard. And it was into this pitch darkness Diemschütz arrived. Turning his pony and cart right and into the gateway, his pony shied to the left and would go no further. After steadying things up, he pushed the animal on, but again it would not move past the entrance. Something was blocking the way. Louis Diemschütz walked to the front and leant himself down into the dark passage, and could make out a large bundle barring his way. So, striking a match, he could just make out that it was the body of a woman. His behaviour at this time is a little strange, but his explanation does make some sense. He immediately worried that it might be his wife who helped him with the management of the club. Whether he thought this was her lying in the gateway knocked out with drink or fearing something else, something more sinister, is unclear, but he left the woman, his pony and his cart and hurried into the club to find his wife and make sure that she was safe. And of course, she was in the club. Having thus ensured his wife's safety, Diemschütz then alerted a friend, Isaac Kozebrodski, to the situation in the yard, and both men raced back down to the spot with candles and lamps. With the help of the lights they had brought, they saw the body, and as she was lying on her back, they saw the wound on her neck. Her throat had been cut. Even from the top of the stairs leading to the club, Mrs. Diemschütz could make out the stream of blood running from the neck of the woman to a pool in the yard. It was obvious the woman was dead, and that she had been murdered. Without disturbing the body, Diemschütz and Kozebrodski ran out and down Faircloth Street, shouting for a policeman. Yet, unable to find a constable, the men turned back, speaking to another man on the way back, and returning with him. Arriving back to the scene, there was a small crowd already gathered around the gate. Shortly after this, the crime was reported to Constable Henry Lamb and another officer on Commercial Road between Christian Street and Batty Street by a Mr. Morris Eagle and another man who had been in the Berner Street club that night. When Lamb shone his bullseye lamp on the scene, he saw for himself the facts of the matter. He dispatched the other constable to fetch a doctor and sent another man to the police station to alert the station of the crime. P.C. Lamb said at the inquest that this was reported to him shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning, so again in the Ripper evidence we have another time conundrum. So thank goodness for the surgeon Mr. Frederick Blackwell, who, on coming to the scene, had the presence of mind to note the exact time from his pocket watch. From the time the policeman arrived at his home at 100 Commercial Road, sometime about 1 o'clock, his getting dressed and following the constable and a medical assistant to Berner Street did not take long. When he reached the scene, it was, according to his watch, precisely 1:16 a.m. From the evidence given by Doctors Blackwell and Phillips the police surgeon, we know that this murder was another blitz attack. The victim had been eating cashew nuts at the moment she was set upon, her attacker quickly and forcibly pulling her backwards by her neck scarf and violently drawing his blade across her neck as she was being lowered to the ground. The assault and the suddenness of the cutting of her throat happened with such speed that she did not even have time to scream out for help, and the cut, although it did not completely sever the arteries on the left and right hand side of the neck, divided her windpipe. Unlike the previous two murders, those of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman, this savage cutting of the throat did not kill the woman instantaneously. Rendered mute by the attack, the woman was left in the wet mud of the gateway to bleed out and suffocate. This difference, along with the marked difference in time and location from the other murders, has led a number of researchers to doubt whether this was the work of the same man. Certainly, there are a great many differences between this case and the other so-called canonical crimes of the Ripper, but the similarities cannot be ignored. This crime was opportunistic, and perhaps it was the most opportunistic and riskiest of the Ripper's killings. Berner Street was not deserted at the time. We know there was noise coming from the club inside the yard, and people were coming and going on the streets around the immediate area. The gateway inside which the crime occurred was the only place of seclusion and relative darkness, but this was not a large area. The doors were open, and we know people were regularly passing through, in and out of the clubhouse. So, As in the case of Nichols and Chapman, the assailant acted with lightning speed, silencing his victim with a single, long, deep, circular incision around the neck. We can be in no doubt whatsoever that this was the actions of a practised hand. Again, this was the crime of an experienced and confident killer. From the examination of the body, both at the scene of the crime and at the post-mortem, we know that the cut to the neck was not as successful as the previous attacks, but this can be easily accounted for. Murder is not an exact science. The intention of the attacker to completely cut through the major arteries of the throat was clear, and there were absolutely no signs of hesitation or inexperience. As both doctors testify, the woman was wearing a scarf about her neck, and the lower edge of this had been frayed by the blade, meaning that this interfered with the cut. Sure, this may not have been much, but it would have been a factor in creating some difference. Something else to bear in mind is that this victim was physically fitter than the previous two. She was well nourished and in a state of relatively better health. Her resistance to the sudden assault would have been significantly more than Nichols and Chapman's. Any number of factors would account for these minor differences. Moreover, the killer was under greater pressure. Dutfield's yard was a passageway leading to a noisy clubhouse, Berner Street, and the surrounding streets had a regular Saturday night traffic of people walking about after the local public houses had closed. People were still coming and going from their homes. This was a well-populated residential area. It was night time and the streets were, of course, less busy than they were in daytime for sure, but this was a Saturday night and most working people in the vicinity had the next day off. Alert to this, it is perfectly reasonable to conclude that the murderer was more nervous, more cautious. What we also know is that he was indeed disturbed in the perpetration of this crime, and it is quite reasonable indeed to assume that the person who disturbed the killer was Louis Diemschütz arriving into the yard with his pony and cart. Louis could see nothing in the darkness behind the wooden doors. It was total darkness. He saw no one leaving the yard as he approached, and the killer had no escape further into the yard. What we can deduce from this information is that it is likely the killer was still inside the yard and probably still skulking in the darkness behind the heavy wooden doors when the hawker dismounted his pony and peered in to see what the obstacle was. We can be almost certain then that the killer was looking down on Louis Diemschütz and the body of the woman when the unwitting hawker struck his match. When Louis Diemschütz returned to the scene with help from the club, the blood was still unclotted and flowing towards the door of the clubhouse, and the surgeon, Mr. Blackwell, said the woman had not been dead much longer than 20 minutes. It is my assumption, and it is a safe assumption, that the man who murdered this woman quietly slipped out past the pony and cart and out through the gates into Berner Street when Louis ran off into the club. We can be in little doubt the killer was expecting to be seen and for the alarm to be raised, and of course this was then a very dangerous moment for Diemschütz. Had he looked up behind the gate, I am certain he would have seen in the dim glow the killer's face looking down on him. He would also have seen the knife that was without doubt poised to come down on him. This was a stroke of luck for the killer. It was a stroke of luck for Louis Diemschütz. The identification of the victim produced something of an extraordinary courtroom farce. When Mrs. Malcolm positively identified the dead woman in the mortuary as her sister, Elizabeth Watts, According to Mrs. Malcolm, Elizabeth was living in poverty in Whitechapel in various common lodging houses. These sisters, according to Mrs. Malcolm's evidence, would meet once a week, and Mary would kindly give her sister a few shillings for food and lodgings. But this entire narrative fell to pieces in the most dramatic fashion when her sister, now Mrs. Stokes, came into the room and called Mrs. Malcolm out for being the most outrageous fantasist. Sure, they had not even seen one another in years. In the end, however, the police were successful in finding Michael Kidney, a man who had been living with a woman, now missing, for the better part of the past 3 years. At the mortuary in St George in the East, he identified the woman as his partner, Elizabeth Stride. Kidney did not in fact know too much about Elizabeth either, owing to her being a bit of a fantasist herself. He was not even certain of what age she was. She had led him to believe that she was 35, but he thought she was more like 36 to 38. She had told him, and anyone else who would listen, that she had lost her husband and 2 children in the September 1878 Princess Alice disaster, a steam pleasure cruiser that had sunk in the Thames, killing over 600 passengers. She had come to London in early 1866 from Gothenburg in Sweden to take up employment with a wealthy gentleman near Hyde Park, or to visit relatives. She gave these 2 different accounts to different sets of people at different times. She had been in domestic service in Gothenburg until 1864, at which point her course took a different turn, with her being charged for prostitution in March 1865, while heavily pregnant. She suffered a stillbirth the following month, and we know she had been treated for venereal disease on a number of occasions. We can only now speculate on the origin of this pregnancy and her departure from domestic service, but it is reasonable to assume that they were connected. It was not unheard of that young household servants were preyed upon by their employers and or their sons. In any event, Elizabeth Gustafsdotter, as was her maiden name, found herself out of a job and engaged in casual prostitution to make ends meet. With a small inheritance after the death of her mother, she came to London, probably looking to make a fresh start, and things did go well in the beginning. Living in the East End, she demonstrated her incredible intellect, learning to speak both English and Yiddish in communication with her neighbours. She took up for a short while with a young policeman and later met and married John Stride, a carpenter from Sheerness. Together the Strides run a coffee shop in Poplar and were, in a modest way, doing well for themselves. But their marriage was a rocky one. By the end of 1877, Elizabeth and John had separated, and times quickly got tough for Elizabeth. Like the other Ripper victims, we find Elizabeth in a number of common lodging houses across Whitechapel, especially on Flower and Dean Street. From this time, she was in a complicated and abusive relationship with Michael Kidney. She reported him for assault but did not pursue the charges, and she would leave him to live in doss houses before returning to live with him. On Wednesday the 26th of September 1888, she and Kidney had had a few words, a right roaring domestic row, and Elizabeth stormed out and rented a bed at a lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street. Over the following days, she earned a few bob cleaning the rooms for the manager and presented herself well. She was going about with friends to various public houses and drinking. She was, as we might say now, blowing off a bit of steam. On the night she was murdered, she was reported to have been seen in the company of a few men, who may or may not have been her clients. Constable William Smith said that he saw her shortly after 12:30 in the company of a man opposite the International Workingmen's Club on Berner Street. There were other similar sightings, one possibly even the beginning of her fatal assault, but nothing was known for sure until Louis Diemschütz came into Dutfield Yard and discovered her lifeless body almost half an hour later. She was a woman who had no real enemies, and from all accounts she was quiet, she was hard-working, and she was well liked. She was one of those people who worked hard to get by and never gave up trying to better herself. Like all the others, she did not deserve her fate. I'll sign off in her native Swedish. God natt, Elisabeth, och god välsignad dig.